Perfect. So we at least will have half of it. We can put a little shout out to you in the beginning. All right, awesome. Okay, so our second speaker is Bobbie Simova. She is a PhD candidate in archaeology at Tulane University. She previously earned an MA in anthropology from the University of Alabama and a bachelor's in anthropology from the University of Illinois. She has participated in a number of projects in the American Midwest, Mexico, and Guatemala, and her dissertation research explores the role of monumental construction in structuring emergent communities through excavation at the site of Actuncan, Belize. Other research interests include ritual practice and social identities as constructed through material objects, particularly ceramics. And her current hobbies include befriending neighborhood cats, which I have to say that is also one of my hobbies, watching supernatural or sci-fi horror movies, and drawing. Today, Bobbie will be presenting on geochemical analysis and the changing roles of the Maya e-groups. So please join me in welcoming Bobbie, and you can start sharing your screen.
One second. Okay. Thank you for having me here today. So I'm presenting on somewhat older research that I was actually really happy to revisit. It was my initial introduction into Actuncan's e-group, and actually a really good introduction to some of the methods that have become really important to my dissertation research. So I was happy to go back to it and revisit that learning process and just think about how the project has changed since that point in time. So to begin with, what are e-groups? It's a term that's very familiar to Maya archaeologists, and the E does not stand for anything special, unfortunately. It just happened to be what this particular architectural complex was labeled at the site where it was first identified for its significance. And now we just call them e-groups from that group E. But they are very distinctive architectural spaces. All right, they have this eastern elongated platform and a western pyramid that define a plaza space. They're really fascinating topic of investigation, garnered a lot of attention because they are really early constructions in the region. Sometimes they're foundational to Maya sites, which is also the case at Actuncan. They seem to have, their alignment seems to coincide with some astronomical solar movements. They seem to relate to agricultural cycles. They are very much communal spaces, and they're often investigated for how they could have played into the negotiation of emergent leadership. And this research actually draws on those investigations. So one thing we know is that at some sites during the late Preclassic period, we start to see changes in the use of the E-group and shifts from some of their more communal functions to indicate that they're being taken over by emergent leaders, rulers, who are adopting more exclusionary forms of kingship. So when at Actuncan, we wanted to trace out some of the political transformations that we saw happening in the households, this was one of the public spaces that we wanted to target next, right? And see, like, what does it tell us about these political transformations? How can we understand the space? And it has been a very productive line of inquiry. So very briefly, Actuncan is a ridgetop site located on the banks of the Mopan River in western Belize. It's constructed over two adjacent hilltops you can see here. And the E-group forms it's part of the northern ridge, and it forms the northeastern extent of the site core. Right, and you see the very distinctive layout here and some of the excavation and testing work that we've done within it. So our work in the E-group does show that it has an early foundation in roughly 1000 BC, right? It's foundational to the site, consistent with some of the other findings. It does undergo important architectural changes over time that are coinciding with major temporal changes and shifts. And it does have a pretty significant period of occupation in the late Preclassic period, that period when we want to study political transformations. In our excavations, we encountered a number of ritual deposits, including 3 burials and a number of caches. But given the long history of occupation and construction that you see here, what do a dozen deposits really tell us about changes that would have been really very dynamic during this time period, right? So this is where chemical analysis comes in, right? For us, it's seen as a window into those more repetitive daily activities that could have happened, right? Things that would have been a little bit more ephemeral, that are harder to access archaeologically, but potentially could give us a much better understanding of what changes are happening, right? What are some of the negotiations, some of the changing uses that are important and relevant to our study? Okay, so, just briefly, I'm assuming a lot of you guys are familiar with this, especially if you work with soils, but chemical analysis in archaeology has developed out of a couple different disciplines, right? It comes to us out of agronomy, geochemistry, and forensics. The association between phosphorus and anthropogenic activity was one that has been established since the 1920s. And with the addition of other chemical elements that has since been identified, it's been very productive for identifying prehistoric activity areas, for seeking out middens, and kind of used in the same archaeological prospecting ways that it was also used in geochemistry, right? Finding certain source locations and things, or mineral deposits. But ethnohistoric and ethnoarchaeological studies have actually really pushed the techniques forward into that they're no longer just indicators of prehistoric activity, they're now means for trying to reconstruct specific activity sets, right? And classic work done by Bobbie and colleagues really demonstrates this. They looked at households as having sort of protected indoor spaces that are nicely delimited. And through these studies, they were able to consistently identify spaces within the home that serve different functions, like food preparation, consumption, resting spaces versus really kind of high traffic areas. And of course, spaces for holding animals, because of course you're going to get chemically enriched floors in those spaces. And the Actuncan project has really made very extensive use of chemical techniques in our work. Several project members have used it in their dissertation work and ongoing studies. So we've built a very good comparative sample of different types of spaces and the chemical signatures we encounter there. And that's what the E-group is sort of building towards. So for example, I have here Carol Fulton's work in the households of Actuncan during the Middle Preclassic period, I want to say, right, where she's really looking for activity spaces both inside and between households. And like, what are some of those economic functions of those spaces? What do they tell us about the households and how they relate to each other? It's been really kind of interesting work. It's been used in a civic ritual space or a palace, and has shown different functions for certain palace rooms. So areas of sort of consumption, areas for storage, perhaps even presence of sort of elite crafting activities, or at least storage of elite goods that are happening here. And in this study, they were able to do some diachronic comparison, looking at these compositions across 2 different occupation surfaces. Another important space where this was applied is in David Mixter's work, and a civic space within the site. Right, so a space that would have more public functions associated with community rulership at the site, that also showed some of the same kind of domestic food consumption production activities. That's, I think, what this hotspot's showing here, burning organic residues, right? So it's given us a really rich data set to compare this initial E-group within, this initial work within the E-group. And I'm actually going to work to extend this in the future. But what I'm presenting here today comes from, from 5 sequential floors located on that eastern elongated structure. And they span, I think, a period of time between around 200 BC to 50 AD, right? So that pre-classic period that's of interest to us. Now, the elongated platform is rather large. Like in final phase, it's over 100 meters long, and our excavations are only 2 meters wide, right? So there was some concern about like how representative is this of the space, but I'm actually pretty confident that we are targeting at least some of the key functions of the space, in that our excavations take place on a center line, and that is known to be a ritually significant and meaningful space. And taking into consideration some of the significant layout properties of the complex, right, it seems like it should tell us something important. Okay, the technical stuff. So each floor was sampled in a 50 centimeter staggered interval grid, which is sort of illustrated here. This is actually a different distance that we used in the plaza. Samples were collected using a clean trowel, so avoiding cross-contamination between the different points, into Whirlpack bags. They're important. Can't use other plastic here. It can mess with your signatures. And this analysis is great because you don't really need a large quantity of material. But when excavators help me, they really want to make sure that I have everything I need. So we end up with very full Whirlpack bags. But, you know, their help is really integral in this. Not yet. Okay, the samples were analyzed. Let's see, the technical part. The samples were analyzed using an inductively coupled mass spectrometer at the University of South Florida. This was directed by Christian Wells. It uses his protocols, which are very well published and discussed. The calibrated concentrations for 21 elements were determined in this case. And, you know, we checked that well with internal quality control standards. But even though there were 21 elements analyzed, because we're working with plaster surfaces, certain elements like calcium, strontium, and aluminum weren't useful to us because they're found in the matrix and they have kind of internal variation that's not very meaningful to us. So there's really 17 remaining elements that are actually more culturally meaningful in this case. And the first thing that Christian said when we had the results is like, those floors are clean. All right, and this is what he meant. Oh, okay. So we do have phosphorus, right? So we have human activity, which is great, but we don't have much of anything else. And this was surprising given a lot of the other spaces that we have at Actuncan that have been tested. There was a benefit to this, and sorry, Tatsuya, but it meant that we didn't really have to go through additional statistical analysis like principal component and factor analysis, because we didn't really need to know the covariation of elements here. We were just dealing with phosphorus in this case. It did simplify things. So after that stage, you know, it's off the board. We move on to interpolation. So this is our key analysis in this case. We use kriging because Christian recommends it, and also because it's what you do for this kind of soil analysis. It has, well, one, it's a very robust modeling system, and it also it weighs the distance between samples is important here, which is very important for this kind of chemical residue analysis. So it's really the way to go. I'm still trying to figure out the mechanics of it in QGIS, but it is a helpful practice. Here you can see the earliest excavated floor in the sample. I don't know if you can see the X's. Those are our sample locations, right? And we have our interpolated surface with the concentration of phosphorus. So this floor is actually one that shows a lot more archaeological evidence of food and drink consumption. There's this sort of cobbly pavement that we see that perhaps served as an altar. It was associated with hute shell, and hute are freshwater snails that are known to be consumed in the region. There's a plate that was associated with this as well. And then over here, we have a pit feature that had several fragmented jars, right? So already an indicator of the ritual significance of food and drink. And we're seeing the phosphates or the phosphorus, right? So it seems consistent. It does seem like it's more widespread and not just limited to popping down these particular deposits. So that was of interest to us. In the next couple of floors, we hardly have any archaeological evidence of activity, right? In this one, you just see one post hole, and these other gray areas are intrusive from later constructions. So we wouldn't really be able to say much, but again, we have this enrichment of the floors, right? So organic deposits are being made here over long periods of time, right? So that they're leaving their mark in the plaster floors. And what I found interesting here is that the concentration seemed to be on the southern edge of the unit, which you can see aligns with where we see the pit and the cobbly deposit. Right, so it seems to maintain that structure center line or reference it in the later construction. Same kind of thing in the next couple of floors. Again, no strong archaeological indicators of activity, but the signature remains. What we see now is that it kind of presents more like little hotspots instead of that broader distribution in the southern portion of the units. This could be a portion of, like, we have less floor here to sample. Same thing here. And then in the last floor, we again see more archaeological markers of ritual activity. So here we have a burial that has been incorporated in the platform. We have a post that appears to, well, that we assume has ritual significance, and actually a series of smaller post features. And here we use data from the nearby site of Xunantunich, where Catherine Brown has identified post holes with wood remains that seem to suggest that perishable structures were repeatedly erected near the E group structures, presumably with some sort of ritual function. So like little altars, right, for the display of offerings. Now what's interesting here is that, okay, if let's say these do represent altar features, I know I haven't been pointing this out, but now our values are much lower. Right? So the phosphate isn't as present. And, you know, there is some difficulty of directly correlating the intensity of the signature to the intensity of activity. But it is kind of nice to think about, like, oh, so the offerings are perhaps not directly on the surfaces anymore. Perhaps they are elevated in these perishable structures, and that allows it to be more easily cleared away, right? And perhaps impacting the signatures. Right, so some interesting stuff happening in the patterns, even if we are just dealing with one element here. So here are the 5 floors together. This is helpful to examine actually, because with this type of analysis, there is a concern about the vertical movement of the elements, which is something that happens. But in this case, we can kind of visually assess that the floors are providing enough of a separation and barrier that we don't have that kind of contamination impacting lower floors from later occupations. And we are seeing some variation, right? But for the most part, pretty consistent use over time, right? Consistent, focused on organic materials, some archaeological indicators suggesting that it's food and drink related. So what do we make of all this? Well, one thing is that maybe the most interesting part is that we have these organic indicators, right? Early interpretations of the E group really highlighted their functions as solar observatories, right? So perhaps you wouldn't expect to have any sort of intense chemical signatures represented, but we do, right? So their functions do seem to be a little bit more complicated, do seem to involve a little more interpretation, but at this point seem fairly distinct from other contexts. So this does seem to be limited use. Because it's just phosphorus, we don't see the other elements associated with food preparation, food consumption. We don't see evidence of wood ash and burning, right? It is sort of limited set of activities occurring here. We don't necessarily think that the platform would be the place for food preparation, but it is surprising that fire is not represented because it is known to have ritual significance from ethnographic and also epigraphic records. So here's like a little sensor, right, for ritualized burning, and that's not being represented. Now, again, we have limited exposure. So some of these activities could be happening within other parts of the complex. And that's something that I'm going to explore with my dissertation research and when I get more samples, especially from the plaza floor in different areas within the plaza. Another surprising absence is of transitional metals, which are associated with craft production and some ritual and elite paraphernalia. So this is really what we'd expect to see, or if we had seen this, it would have been a potentially clear sign for us, especially in the later periods, that there is some co-option of the space for elite ritual displays or political displays. But there is a question of, we do find those minerals in elite contexts, but those are also contexts related to production and storage, right? So how much would you expect to see in a performance space? Now, I'm not ready to say that you wouldn't expect to see anything. You know, I think analyzing more of these spaces would help us to really determine of like, what is the range of possibilities, right? What is realistic to expect in these sorts of spaces? I mean, we find materials from regalia, right, that have broken off and been deposited in other contexts. So, you know, why not? It's not completely out of the question. But as it stands, the evidence seems to, for the most part, suggest that at least Actuncan's E-group retained a lot of consistent ritual functions, limited ritual functions, that don't suggest that it was incorporated into different political strategies in the late preclassic period. Right, so it maintained kind of those essential communal ritual functions that are normally attributed to the space. Right, so if you want to look for that political negotiation, perhaps look outside of the E-group for this time period. Now, I would say that those kinds of negotiations, I still believe are happening within the space, but where I'm looking for it is actually in the earlier occupations of the E-group, and I'm looking within the plaza space. Right, so I'm trying to extend this a little bit further, incorporate more locations, more signatures, and see what happens. You know, I find it unlikely that the space remains unchanged for very long periods of time. It's possible, and if that's the case, that's telling us something really fascinating about its uses and significance. But you know, to be determined.
Awesome. Thank you, Bobbie. That was a really fascinating presentation. Yeah, I don't do my virtual claps. Do we have any questions? I know I have some questions, but I will open the floor first. Any pressing questions? Well, I could start with mine. So I have a few. Which one do I want to? So you mentioned that it might be difficult to determine intensity. So I think the first thing that popped into my head was, can you use phosphorus to argue occupation intensity? Because I know a lot of studies are always trying to say like, this layer was heavily occupied, and there's always issues with how people do that. So I was curious what your thoughts were on that and any challenges there are to use phosphorus signatures in order to argue intensity.
I think you would need a lot of other supporting evidence, because some of the complicating factors are, these are surfaces that are left out in the open, that are deteriorating over time. They're being swept, they're being rained on, right? So it's all impacting the way that these chemicals are being incorporated into the plaster, or like whatever porous surface you're studying, right? So that's where the problem is. And we've actually, David Mixter has done some Bayesian modeling of the occupation. So we do know that not all of these floors are occupied for the same amount of time. Like some are left open a lot longer than others, right? So if they're seeing more, or they're seeing activity over more continuous spans of time, right, that's going to accumulate more signatures, right? So it's a little difficult. I mean, I think you could make a fairly convincing argument as long as you have some of these other factors of like, what is the preservation of the floor? Can you be a little more specific about how long it was occupied? Do you have any other archaeological indicators of intensity of use? Right, so some will have more ritual deposition, like, well, something may be happening here, right? That's telling us it is actually intensity, but tricky to do it just from the chemical analysis alone.
That's fair. And sorry, one more question. How do you identify these floors? Because it's a little different than my background. I study like Paleolithic, so very different.
Oh man, and you know what? I've worked in the Midwest here, so yes, these are actually really nice because they're plaster. So in excavations, you hit them and right? Yep. Not always the case. Like some are pretty deteriorated. You're like, I'm not sure what this is. Like, is this a surface or is this just kind of like a limey film? But a lot of these were very nicely made plaster floors. So like you hit them, you start finding like polished surface. You're like, okay.
That's fair.
Yeah. And it's surprisingly, so we had to mark a lot of them as we were going, because at some point we were like, oh, we have a lot of floors, and then we had like complicated staircase things happening and a lot of reworking. So we had to mark them because they were clear to us as we were excavating down. But at some point, looking at the profile, it became a little bit more difficult. It's like, oh, I thought this would be like crystal clear. Not the case. Start putting markers in there.
Any other questions? We are over time, so if you have to leave for another meeting or something, feel free to. But I'm happy to stick around if there's any other questions. Oh, Rachel. Oh, sorry. I couldn't. I thought you were still muted.
Oh, can everyone hear me? Okay. Yeah, my question was more so about, a little bit more background about the site, because at the beginning you mentioned that, these e-groups seem to be correlating with, these shifts from communal practices to more exclusionary kinship things. And I'm just curious what else is going on at the site and like what other evidence within the site kind of suggests this transition.
So actually one of the other ritually significant complexes seems to be important here. In the southern ridgetop, we have a triadic temple complex, and David Mixter is actually currently working on that, right? So there is kind of potentially a shift happening from the E group to sort of a ritual focus moving down there. And there's a lot more elaborate displays. So there's plaster masks that are elaborating the building. It's a much more massive construction, right? In a more kind of spatially delimited space. So that's one thing. Then in the classic period, we have some of the sort of administrative structures that are being reworked to create the like palace space, right? So that's another indicator. A lot of the indications come from households actually, and it's the initial focus of research at the site, where we see certain kind of upstart households that are coming in, right? They're larger, they have some fancier things, but their fortunes seem to be very closely tied to the ups and downs of kingship within the region, where some of the other, quote unquote, commoner households, I mean, they're still nice households, they're in the site core, they're not that common. They seem to be a lot more stable over time. Right? So there's a couple different threads of evidence that are feeding into this. And it is interesting that the group's not really, at least so far, is not really showing these kind of strong indications that this is one of the spaces. Now we do have burials there, and I have to kind of account for those. But I need more evidence and more dates on when that's happening. So.
All right, any other questions? I guess I just have like a quick question about the, you said it was ICP-MS work, is that correct that you did? Mm-hmm. Did you do that on like the specific plaster floors? So did you collect like a piece of plaster and analyze that, or what like material were you using?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we collected from the surface of the plaster. So actually like scrape a thin layer off the very, very surface just because the construction fills above and, us working in there. Mm-hmm. But yeah, we do create a collector across different points and we are trying to target the kind of surface layer of the plaster floor as much as we can.
Okay, cool.
I'm just curious about what's the common patterns for future for ritual in this area, in your research area?
Usually cash deposits, right? And especially in kind of locations that seem to be significant. So I made a big deal out of the structure center line, right? These seem to be kind of liminal spaces within Maya ideology. And there's a lot of sort of ensoling of buildings at the initiation of construction. There's specific terminations of buildings as well that are referenced in these spaces. So it's like materials that can kind of look like trash, at least in a lot of it in our site, right? But it's in these special locations. Now at some other sites you do get nicer materials like jadeite, full pots that have certain spatial arrangements, combinations of ceramics that represent sort of Maya cosmology, so like lip-to-lip bowls that contain, precious materials referencing water, earth. I think there's obsidian jadeite shell is often found in those kinds of deposits, sometimes bone. So that's usually our evidence. Yeah.
Well, we are definitely over. I thank you all for hanging out. Did we have any last quick questions? I don't want to keep you all for too much longer. No. Okay, well, I'm sure you can email our speakers too if anything pops up, and there will be a recording, unfortunately, of just half of it. So sorry, John, we had technical difficulties in the beginning. But yeah, so that will be on YouTube. And thank you all for coming. This was awesome. Our presenters was great. I hope you all really enjoyed this. And our next brown bag will be March 18th. We'll only have one speaker, so it'll be a little bit shorter, mainly due to time zone issues. But yeah, I hope to see you all there. Keep an eye out for the flyer. It will definitely be passed around within the next week. And thank you again to John and Bobbie and all of the ambassadors. Yes, I hope you guys all have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, you too. And thank you everyone for coming.